laws will have to be imposed, and a world governing body will be created to enforce them.
Welcome to Tinfoil Hat. We go deep, homeboy. Eric, open your mind. Drink from the fountain of knowledge.
I'm very excited because we're about to do part 3 of the topic we can't get enough of, and that's Anunnaki, Eagle versus Serpent, and back by popular demand, one of TFH's favorite guests, Matt LaCroix. How are you, Matt?
It's great to be back here for another discussion. We're going to either end out or continue with part 3.
Oh, there's going to be dude, these are going to be like Disney and Star Wars. And joining us, biting at the bit, is one of my favorite people on the planet. I have many long talks with him, and he's got a lot of great projects going on. And I consider him a good friend, and I'm super happy he's on the show from the Conspiracy Farm. My good friend and yours, Mr. Jeffery Wilson. How are you, Jeffrey?
I'm doing very well, man. As always, every single day above ground's a good day. And just, thankful to be alive, thankful to be sitting here chopping it up with you guys. What's up, XG? I don't think we have necessarily formally met or chopped it up before, but
what's up, man?
Thanks
How's
for
it
the
going?
invite, man. Anxious for this conversation.
And with that,
thank you.
I just want to get into this, Matt. Where do we start? We're just going to sit back, make a couple comments here and there, but Matt, do what you got to do. Where do we start?
I just want to say, first and foremost, I appreciate Jeffrey joining us for this great conversation because he can bring a lot to the table. And of course, you too, Sam and XG, thanks a lot. So where we left off last time, we did part 1 and 2, and today we're going to continue with part 3. And I'm calling this the conquering of the Americas and the destruction of the Serpent civilizations. Okay. And I think that this episode, of all the 3 we've done, this may touch the nerve or the heart, depending on how you want to look at it, of a lot of different people, because we're going to be breaking the lid off of what really happened with these conquistadors, who we're still celebrating as heroes falsely in our culture today. We're gonna bring the madness of what they really did when they came here, and we're gonna break down this eagle and serpent war that's been going on the planet for thousands of years. So I guess let's jump in, right?
Well, real quick, before we start, for those who might be just tuning in for the first time, explain as quickly as you can what the eagle represents and what the serpent represents.
Okay, so these are 2 symbols that have very, very powerful meanings. And you can go to very deeply with the levels of how far back they go. The first depictions we have of eagle symbolism can be found all the way back in Mesopotamia, where we have these images of what we consider these Anunnaki gods and all these various images of these eagle-headed wisdom bringers, you could call them, and all these things back in the day. And of course, we have serpent symbolism that goes just as far back to the very beginning. So we're talking about symbols that go back more than 20,000 years. Okay, so what do they mean, right? We got to break this open, and we got to separate maybe what the biblical versions have been, so we can get the truth out here. The symbol of the serpent has, besides when it became demonized and became inverted later on, but it originally always, from the beginning, it meant wisdom, obtaining higher knowledge, obtaining balance. It was basically how do you obtain higher states of consciousness. That's what the symbol of the serpent represents. Whereas the symbol of the eagle does not represent freedom and sovereignty and all these things we've been told. It actually represents conquering, controlling others, dominion, ruling over them, ruling over them with an iron fist.
How would you describe it? How'd you describe it last? It's like.
Well, think of it this way. The eagle is the highest flying bird of all, right? So it sees everything. That's what that really means.
All-seeing
It represents it having control.
As opposed to Ben Franklin wanting the turkey as the original symbol, like you said.
Yes.
That's right, and we're gonna get into that as we get down into the Freemasons and the founding fathers when they came to the country. So I want to throw this out there just to start, so you can get an idea of how extensive these symbols have been throughout our history. I want to give you a list of some of, not all of, the various flags and crests throughout the past that have had an eagle or a phoenix on them.
Let's go down the list of these flags.
Okay, and what this represents, it means most of the time these cultures and civilizations that had an eagle or a phoenix on its flag or crest became a warring empire, just like we're talking about with what the eagle really represents. Okay, so, and this might blow people's minds, and I want people to go online and go look up eagle flags throughout history, or various different names you can give of that. Maybe XG can pull that up. Eagle flags and crafts. We're talking about this as we go. Well, you can find images that show all of them, like I'm about to go over right now. Albania, Austria, Colombia, Czech Republic, Egypt, England, France, Germany, Iraq, Libya, Mexico, Moldova, Montenegro, Philippines, Poland, Romania, Russia, Serbia, Spain, United Arab Emirates, the United States, and Yemen. So we're talking about over 20 different countries. There you go. That have had eagle flags and crests since the very beginning. And it really tells the story of it. In most cases, those countries that had those symbols became warring empires. Now, before I go any further, I want to just throw out a little bit of information that people really might be rather surprised about. The name America does not come from this Italian explorer. We're told his name was Americus Vespucius. Okay, if you what we're about to go over, if you look at what the indigenous cultures called this region, if we're talking about North America down through Mesoamerica into South America, they all had this name that they used to describe the region, and they called it Amaruca. Now tell me if you think, if they're much older than this Italian explorer that came here, and they had the name Amaruca they were using to call the region, where do you think the name came from? Because the name Amaruca means land of the plumed or feathered serpent, and that's what we're about to go over and talk about all this. And so we've been even deceived all the way down to the very beginning of even where the name America came from.
This is like literally the psyop.
It is the psyop. We've been talking about that, Jeffrey.
It is the Matrix. It literally, I think one of you guys said it, and I think the Matrix was a documentary, dude. I mean, for real.
No, I like that. I like that. And so what we find is this. When you go back to the very beginning, you see that, oh wow, so the eagle and serpent symbolism isn't just from the last several hundred years. It actually goes back to the very beginning. And what it meant how these civilizations were being ruled, either what started them or even in some cases what corrupted them. Like you can see with the flag of Mexico, with the eagle holding and tearing apart the serpent. Okay, that's a very telling story of what we're about to get into. So we're going to go back to the beginning of the Americas, because we've already covered a lot of the rest of the world, but we left the Americas because it falls into this entire other category that needs to have its story told in one part to not lose anything. But so the Americas, the original name for the Americas was Amaruca, meaning the land of the plumed or the feathered serpent, and that's what we're about to get into.
Oh my God!
Okay.
What's a feathered serpent? Are we talking dinosaurs?
Right? A feathered serpent, Sam, is if you have a serpent and the serpent represents this metamorphosis of higher consciousness. What is feathered or plumed but a dragon? If you have this metamorphosis idea behind, look at the caduceus medical symbol that you see on ambulances and hospitals. You have this serpent that's coiled around with wings at the top. It's always been about this metamorphosis of human consciousness so that we can transform ourselves into a higher state. That's what the serpent is. It's the beginning before it transforms into the dragon. Okay. So when you talk about a plumed or a feathered serpent, all you're talking about is the metamorphosis of the serpent into its highest form, which is the dragon. Okay. And both the dragon and the serpent have been demonized for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Okay. We think about how many things represent the dragon as this evil thing that's guarding treasure.
I mean, going back to the original sin, like, the decision to, between good and evil, and and enlightenment was between, you know, the serpent, but was
Yeah.
supposedly the bad guy in that whole scenario.
Yeah, people are 100%. That's unbelievable.
See
That's
what I
I'm
mean?
saying, the psyop of all psyops. I mean, that goes to the very essence of religion and cosmology and why are we here and eternal life, et cetera, et cetera. And they completely have inverted the
That's
thing.
right.
It's really insane.
Jeff is dead on. Essentially, what happened is you had powerful organizations, mostly through some of the church and some of the corruption that occurred with some of these elite families, where they decided, hey, I have a great idea. Why don't we just hide all of the ancient history stuff, not just through suppression and locking it away in the Vatican archives, but let's just invert everything to the complete opposite, so that people don't even know what the truth is, so that they think nothing's connected. Okay, and that's what's happened. So we're taking back history, my friends.
Yes, we are. That's so crazy, dude. Because like you
That
said, it
is
goes back thousands of
unbelievable.
years.
So I want to throw out the first little piece of info before we jump into this. But so there have been these continuous cycles of destruction and dramatic changes that have gone on the earth for the last 50 to 100,000 years. It's this cycle up and down, these natural cyclical processes that occur. Okay, and you can see that with Greenland ice core samples. And why does that matter? Well, the reason it matters is because these disasters have destroyed civilization after civilization. So what we perceive as the Inca and the Maya and the Aztec are actually their ancestors. And I'm about to get into that. It's going to help people really understand why these cultures ended up doing what they did and then how they ended up becoming conquered. So the Hopi, the Maya, and the Aztec all claim that there have been at least 3 different previous ages of mankind, which means you have an age of mankind that becomes sophisticated and advanced, becomes destroyed, and then another one emerges, reaches to another certain point where they reach knowledge and they build all these incredible structures, then they become destroyed, and then it gets reset again. So try to wrap your heads around that. This is the 3rd or 4th age of mankind that we're living in right now, which means if we were to have a disaster occur, right? Let's just say a huge asteroid hit the Earth today, and the whole world was knocked out of power, and there was all these disasters, and we were all wiped out, except for maybe just the indigenous cultures that could still survive because we have hunting and gather skills, and we have largely lost our understanding of how to survive on the planet, right? But let's say that happened and we were all destroyed. And then thousands of years later, we could be in the same situation, that another culture could emerge that didn't even believe we ever existed in the first place.
Yeah.
How mind-blowing that to wrap your head around.
Well, it's like we said in the last show. It's like that's the scene from The Matrix where, Neo meets the architect and he's like, wow, you're different than the other one. And then he shows like the 9 other that have come before him where they develop it, they get either too small or complacent, or they get angry and they destroy it, then they start it up again. And I wouldn't doubt
again,
that.
we have come and gone. I mean, going back possibly several 100,000 years, and that they again, through these Abrahamic cults, no disrespect anybody who loves religion or whatever, but they have completely inverted reality through you have billions of people who are literally taught, I'm sorry again, I don't mean to keep prefacing with apologies, a false reality, billions of people. Yeah. And they teach us, no, there was no other previous civilization. We started from these knuckle dragon simpletons to now we're sophisticated, as opposed to we've been dope the whole time, but they've been trying to keep us from this. Crazy shit.
It is.
That's right.
Crazy,
It's a great point.
Crazy.
Go ahead, Sam.
No, Matt, go on. I mean, dude, it's mind blowing. It's just the whole thing's a lie. It's just like the Anunnaki. I mean, we just had, Randall Carlson on, who basically, through his point of view, confirmed that there was some major catastrophe event, basically wiped out life on the earth, or wiped out a lot of the earth, and then you put those pieces with you, and it's like, wow, now we got. It all comes together, man. It's like the more and more you learn this, the more you think, oh, there's all these 80 different conspiracies. And then the more and more and more you look at it, the more and more they're not all different conspiracies. They're just
it
all
always begs
pieces.
the huge question with any of these huge conspiracies. Why? Why are they doing this? And like I've said before, and that's on my freaking cover page of my Facebook page, Morpheus holding up the batteries, people losing their mind over the NFL draft. No disrespect, we like the NFL draft, but it's like, really?
Here's what happened. You were talking about Randall Carlson. He's talking about these cataclysms that occurred, what was called the Younger Dryas. Okay, and it's not that complicated. We had an ice age 12,000 years ago on the planet, and when that ice age ended, it ended so abruptly from a comet strike and other various changes that it was one of the catalysts that led to the destruction of the last of these ancient civilizations that were wiped out. Okay, and a lot of the new data though that's coming back that a lot of researchers like Brian Forster and Graham Hancock are talking about is that what we think of as the Inca and the Egyptians and all of these other cultures, they're actually the ancestors of previous more sophisticated civilizations that they simply just had to piece together all the information they had. And every subsequent time we lost more and more information till we eventually became what we are now, which is somewhat ignorant of what actually happened back then.
And you could see that in the construction down there, some of those things too, like the way the base of a lot of these structures are completely mind-blowing, how they were able to do this with some of these rocks and the formations, and then some of these more rudimentary formations were built on top of that. Like you said, it's something that was obviously came before.
Exactly. So he's talking, what Jeffrey's talking about is, if you look at a place like Machu Picchu, okay, you in places in Machu Picchu, you can see this clearly. There's all this building with these small little cobble rocks, right? And then there's these one areas with these massive blocks that are perfectly designed that don't look like anything else around them. And right on top of them, you see this other very simplistic building where you can say, oh, well, what happened? Well, what happened was those advanced civilizations were destroyed by these cataclysms. And then the indigenous people of the region moved back in long after, and they found all these sites that were all destroyed and knocked over with jungle growing all around them. And they said, and they found some of the wisdom and knowledge they left, and they tried to recreate them, but they couldn't. So when we say, oh, I can't believe the Aztec were doing blood sacrifice and war. I thought they were supposed to be these enlightened cultures. No, that's the ancestors who were corrupted later on. And we're going to go into that right now. So don't use the more recent indigenous cultures as a way to judge what these ancient civilizations were back then, okay?
Are the new lasers that they're using to uncover the stuff in Guatemala, is that going to bring out more of this ancient civilization?
Yeah.
You've heard of that, right? The lasers?
So you're talking about the Mayan territory, and just like we were mentioning, Jeffrey and I were talking about with the Inca, you see the same thing in the Maya. You see this larger building in some parts of these structures with this more primitive building right on top. And then, so what do most people say? Oh, look, here they built this, right? No, this is multitudes of different cultures that build on top of each other. That's why when you see obelisks and these different structures in Egypt, and you see the hieroglyphics and the writing on them, and some mainstream archaeologists will say, look, these are the dynastic Egyptians that did this. No, they just moved in after and claimed them to try to say they built them, like the Great Pyramid of Giza that we're still told is called Khufu's pyramid, even though it has nothing to do with Khufu the pharaoh at all. Dude. So let's get into these serpent civilizations of Muruga, okay? Just remember that name. When you go north to south, let's start in North America. You see the indigenous cultures that built these serpent mounds all over the place, okay? Serpent mounds, right? As you head south, well, and you get into the Aztec and then the Maya, and you see, okay, so the Aztec were worshiping this serpent god named Quetzalcoatl. We're worshiping this serpent god named Kukulkan, right? And you start being like, well, wait a minute, maybe that's the same influence. Maybe that's the same influence that happened long ago. And I want to connect on how that relates to all of these things. And remember, I was mentioning how these pre-dynastic Egypt, the pyramids and all these ancient structures were actually built much, much longer than we're being told. So what that means is, who were those builders, right? Who were they? Those builders that that built the pyramids of Egypt and started those civilizations, which was called Chem long ago, those are the same priests and masons and like some of these Egyptian influences of wisdom like Thoth. They're the same ones who then came over to the Americas and started all of those serpent civilizations.
And that name Chem, that's where we get chemistry and alchemy.
What?
That's the root word for Chem.
That's right. So the word alchemy, which means you can manipulate the world around you, it even gets down into understanding ancient magic, believe it or not, even though a lot of people don't believe that's real. But that represents the ability to manipulate your environment. And those ancient teachers back then were masters of their reality. And so the first place they created after the destruction had destroyed places like Atlantis, which I encourage people to really look into. Those cultures, those masons and priests, high priests that left Atlantis, the first place they went was Egypt, and they created the culture known as Chem. Now, Jeff just pointed out the word Chem is the root word that became alchemy, alchem.
Oh,
in
my
fact,
God.
it was not just called Chem. Another word for it was alchem. I mean, it doesn't get any closer than that, right? Alchemy.
Right. Yeah.
So that's where it all began.
Yeah.
And that goes back to Matrix stuff. If you can manipulate your reality, remember, like there's no rules. The rule is to your brain.
There is no spoon, baby. There is no spoon.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Dude, listen, man.
That's it. That's what
Here's
that
the thing. Here's my opinion, man. Is like you can completely control your reality. Yes, I can't fly. Okay, I can't fly, but I can control and manipulate a lot of shit. And going back to Matt's first appearance about the bloodlines and these Anunnakis picks. So, but like you can control a lot of your life with a certain way of seeing and acting and believing. And there is no reality. There's only perception. And your perception determines what you think your reality is.
So that goes to the heart of kind of what we're talking about, why they do this, what you just articulated. So they have to create these narratives to basically have you live in fear.
Yep.
Except this certain individual is your begotten son, or you're damned to eternal damnation and fire and all that other shit, as opposed to embracing what you just said.
Yep.
You know the temple, the one that has the serpent when it's the equinox? See that serpent that goes right there? That only happens when the equinox shows up, which is maybe like everywhere, I think.
Really?
So that's called Kukulkan's temple, and that represents the temple of Ascension. Each level represents a higher level of human consciousness.
So
Dude, let's organize a field trip, guys. Let's get like a shit ton of us and go there on that day.
So, but what you're saying is that the Aztecs or the Mayans had nothing to do with that? You're saying that's
no. So what we think of as a Maya, that structure you can see right there. If you look really closely at the whole structure, you can see that at the very bottom, there's some of the stones are much larger than the others, much larger. They're more precisely designed compared to the other cobble that's around them, and that represents you can call them the pre-Maya, the original civilization that was here when Kukulkan was influencing them. Okay.
Wow.
So let me get into the proof behind who these influences were. They're not just like some spirit of nature that they were worshiping, and it doesn't really matter because it's not really connected to anything. That's absolutely not the case. Remember, we were saying these pyramid priests and these masons that had left Egypt at the very beginning, like what we call was called Chem, after they built the pyramids. Okay.
Go on. Yeah.
They traveled over to Mexico and created all these civilizations. And where's the evidence behind that? If you pull up an Olmec head right now, XG, pull up an Olmec head statue, and you'll see clearly that's an African. Oh shit! That's an African face. Okay. And what that shows you is that Egypt is in Africa. See, as they came over, they traveled west, and they brought some of these cultures of Africa with them. Those are African representations of the Olmec people. Okay, that's
as
what
did Thoth, right? Didn't Thoth come over to the west and write emerald tablets?
And so that's what I'm going to get into. So when you ask the indigenous people of the Maya and the Aztec and the Inca, including when they say, okay, well, who was this god Kukulkan? who was this god Quetzalcoatl? Who was this god Viracocha? Every single time the indigenous people said, and they described it as this elderly, tall man with a long beard. And if you look up the indigenous cultures in that region, they can't grow facial hair.
What?
So it's proof. They can't grow facial hair. It's just it's a trait they have. They don't have beards. That influence came from elsewhere. Okay, which is why we're going to get into how Cortés was able to conquer the Aztec, because they were confused about whether or not he was one of these returning gods. Okay.
Yeah, because it doesn't make sense, right? Because it's like 300 conquerors
let him into an empire of Aztecs, of warriors, that
like
savage
100,000.
It's because they thought he was a god. They thought there was Quetzalcoatl that was supposed to come and save him.
And so getting back into this Atlantean connection with Egypt, I want to point this out, and this is something that's going to blow people's minds. In Mexico, okay, one of the Aztec sites known as Tula, Tula, Mexico. They have these enormous statues in Tula, Mexico they're literally called the Atlantean Warriors. That's what the statues were, because what happened, there they are right there. Okay. What essentially they're the guardians, because Thoth coming out of Egypt, he started the whole point behind Chem Egypt with the pyramids is they were trying to resurrect Atlantis that had been destroyed, the civilizations of Atlantis. Okay. And so when they came over, they founded early pre-dynamic Aztec Egypt, and they came through Africa and they ended up in the Americas. They were trying to create a new Atlantis. That's also, in some ways, if you look at the designs behind Washington, D.C., and why there's an obelisk there in Washington, D.C., you can see that that's also what the founding fathers were trying to do too. It's essentially the same thing. Okay, so those Atlantean warriors represent this attempt to restart and create these grand civilizations of Atlantis. And they actually failed.
That they were trying to summon the Anunnaki to come.
I actually think that it represents what was called sacred geometry. So what these masons and priests that came out of these civilizations that tried to create and start this new Atlantis, the masons were all about sacred geometry and creating perfect structures that harmonize with these energy ley lines like we talked about. Okay, it's all about energy. It's all about higher consciousness, wisdom, and energy. That's what this is all about. Okay, so when you go to places like, when you go to Chichen Itza, which is where Kukulkan's temple is, you find in these certain areas out away from the crowds. I was there doing some research. You find this place called the Platform of the Eagles and Jaguars. Okay, and on that little ruin, you find the serpent symbology everywhere, symbolism covering it with these Kukulkan images, but you also see the eagle. And the eagle isn't providing knowledge, it's actually eating a human heart, representing blood sacrifice and corruption. Okay? So what you find when you look at that is it's telling a story. It's telling the story of what happened to these civilizations, where they were first given all this wisdom and knowledge by these serpent gods, and then later they were corrupted. There it is right there. Let's take a look at that for a second, okay? That represents the eagle eating a human heart. Some even say it might represent the pineal gland, like eating knowledge and consuming it. As in,
I've heard that one.
To control these cultures, right? So you have all these serpents around and surrounding it, and then you have this center, this depiction of the eagle. Now, at the same time, as these cultures were being corrupted, they've turned into warlike cultures. And what did they call their warriors in the Aztec? They called them the Eagle Warriors. Okay, it just keeps wrapping around and connecting to all these things over and over again.
I'm sure it's similar to like what the Jesuits say, or give me your kid for the first 6 or 7 years and I have them for life. Yeah. You know what I mean? Most Eagle Scouts are raised with that symbology, meaning, like Matt says, freedom and all that other stuff. So when they get older, it just becomes default mode.
So let's get into some of these timelines to understand. So before these conquistadors had come over to the Americas, these cultures had already been corrupted. They had already been corrupted by other influences. Two different influences. One, Remember what I said? They were not the original builders of these temples everywhere. They came later, and they didn't have the knowledge had already been largely lost. So they got desperate, and there was because there was a lot of changes to the climate going on. There was droughts, those various things. They started actually trying to worship these eagle gods by using blood sacrifice to try to call them in, thinking that was gonna assist them, because they had already been corrupted by some of these influences. Okay. And there actually are underworld beings connected to the Anunnaki, such as Nergal, that the Maya have represented through these various beings. They call one of them was called God El. I encourage people to go look into God El of the Maya, because all of a sudden you have these serpent gods, and then you have these eagle gods that corrupted them through blood sacrifice and war. So when we're looking at what corrupted these cultures, it was a two-step process. They were already corrupted through blood sacrifice and becoming warlike, and then they got conquered by these conquistadors from Spain, who was flying the eagle flag on their crests way back in the day. Okay, and so it just keeps connecting back to, well, what is the real story of what happened between these? And so we're going to jump ahead now to these famous dates that a lot of people have heard of, right? 1492, 1519, and 1532. Between those years, the Spanish were able to conquer the entire Americas, from the north to the south. And one of the things we get taught in school was that the major reason why the indigenous cultures died off was because they got sick from different diseases that the Spanish brought, which is true. But it's being used as the scapegoat to explain and try to cover up the fact that they killed over 100,000 indigenous people. Some even think it could be as high as 200,000-300,000, if not more. Hundreds of thousands of indigenous people were literally murdered by these conquistadors and their armies when they were taking over these regions. Okay.
So which may not sound like a lot now with 6-7 billion people, but back then there was significantly less people in this area.
Oh yeah, what was the popul? That's a great point, Jeffrey. What was the population probably of Earth at this time? Was it even 1 billion? Was it 500 million? No. Was it like? I mean, like
in fact, what we're about to go over, Tenochtitlan,
112 million,
the city of the Aztec that Cortés conquered. Had one of the largest centers of population on the entire planet at the time. It had a population center of over 200,000 people. Back then, that was a very, very large city. Some think it could even have had more, well over that as well. So these Spanish conquistadors, they conquered from the Pueblo and Hopi of the Southwest United States, and then all the other indigenous cultures of North America, down through the Aztec, Maya, all the way to the Inca. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to break out the truth here based on evidence. And I highly encourage people to go look up anything that I'm talking about right now and verify it, because we're being told in all our history books that these conquistadors are the heroes because they found a land where there was these primitive, savage people, and they made it so it's civilized, and they helped all the people. But what they actually did was destroy all their cultures and just take over the land for themselves. And then what was even worse was they injected false information into their history to try to create these misconceptions, like with the Aztec on how they founded the city of Tenochtitlan and all these things. So when you look at what really happened, with them coming over and stealing all the rare artifacts and these sacred texts that connected all the way back to the very beginning, they essentially just plundered and stole it and then destroyed all these cultures. Okay, so let's start from the beginning, because people are going to love this. Columbus is one of these great heroes that we're finally just realizing that, oh my God, he wasn't such a hero, was he?
He's an asshole.
And now we're starting to call this Indigenous Day, right?
Interesting who we make heroes out of in this country.
Oh yeah, dude, it's the upside down world. I mean, it is the upside down world.
It is. Everything's inverted. So like we were talking about before with St. Patrick and all these other heroes, most of who we think are heroes are actually the villains, and the people that we demonize are the ones that were good. It's almost the complete opposite in many of these cases. Okay, no, so let's open up our history books and let's break open the truth, and let's try to destroy all these misconceptions that we've been given. We're told in 1492 Spain sent, which is true, obviously, but Spain sent this conquistador from the Eagle over to the Americas. And they tell us it was simply because they wanted to find a new trade route.
Yeah.
A new spice trade route to help Spain. Oh, let's get a new route so we don't have to go all the way around this long way. And that's what you're sent there for, is just to find a new route. Except for when he came to the Americas, he never even made it as far as Mexico. If you're trying to find a Western trade route, what you're about to see completely proves the opposite. So in 1492, Columbus lands in what was the present-day Bahamas. Okay, he was met by a very peaceful tribe, actually, called Lusayan people, who was a branch of the Taino tribe who lived in the Caribbean islands. It was just peaceful people. They were living the good life. And here comes Columbus. He lands on their shores. And I kid you not, go look this up. It'll blow your mind. The first thing he did, he met these Lusayan people. He walked up to them. He introduced themselves. And they were, of course, enamored because they'd never seen anyone like this before. And they weren't sure who he was and everything. The first thing that he did was he noticed that these indigenous people of the Caribbean were wearing gold jewelry around their neck, gold jewelry on their hands. And the first thing he did was take them and take them as slaves. And he forced them to tell him where they got the gold from. Okay. And so Columbus takes all these peaceful people and he forces them to take them all over the Caribbean to find where they found the gold. And Columbus ends up in Hispaniola, which is Cuba and the Dominican Republic over to Puerto Rico.
Oh, this guy.
Because that area was the source of all the gold in the Caribbean. And there still is mining that goes on there today. Again, all we're told is that Columbus was trying to find this Western trade route, spice route for Spain, right? Except that he made 3 different trips. I don't know if people know this. So he comes over, he goes to the Bahamas, and instead of just going just a little ways west past Cuba, and be like, oh, wow, look, here's Mexico, and here's another entire area where it continues west so we could try to find a route. He never even made it to Mexico. He never even got there. He came to this region, found all this gold, and he never went anywhere else. What he did was he was not only acquiring gold, but he was acquiring slaves for the Spanish Empire. So the 3 different times he went back to Spain, he came back with a ship full of these indigenous cultures from the Caribbean that they forcefully took as slaves. And what he was doing was he took the indigenous people of the region and he made them mine gold. And whereas I've seen figures something like 60 or 70 or 80% of all these indigenous cultures that were mining in these mines all died, because the conditions were so severe and hot and incredibly difficult to work in, that they essentially just worked until they died and didn't have any water. And so Columbus would take other groups as slaves back to Spain. He would return again and keep mining these regions until the gold eventually started to dwindle. And then what did they do? Well, then they decided, hey, let's go conquer the rest of the Americas. And that's exactly what they did, because they knew what was there. Well, the misconception that we're being told is that they had no idea where any of that stuff was. They knew. That's why they sent these soldiers of the church. That's what Columbus, Cortés, and Pizarro were. They were soldiers. I mean, highly trained military soldiers that were very, very smart, that knew how to try to get around these cultures. Because look, if they had tried to attack something like the Aztec Empire without playing some very clever little tricks, they would have been decimated. We're talking about only a couple hundred people trying to take on 200,000 people. And that's what we're going to get into right now. And I think the story of Cortés and the story of Cortés and Pizarro is potentially even worse than Columbus, if you can try to wrap your head around that, okay? And remember, these were all these ancient serpent civilizations that have been influenced by these serpent gods before. And so this was, in many ways, the eagle conquering the serpent civilizations. So in 1519, Cortés, another one of these Spanish soldiers, his name was Hernan Cortés, he landed on the shores of Mexico and near the present-day town of Veracruz. And Cortés is tasked with trying to conquer the entire Aztec Empire. And he knows very well the difficulties involved in that. Okay, they're a warring culture at this point. who was much, much more in a completely different situation than these peaceful Caribbean tribes, nowhere in the same level. And so what he did was, and this is amazing. It's some of these things that's kept out of the history books. Cortés knows that the soldiers he's with, this group that he's leading with him, they're very, very nervous. They know that what they're about to do might lead to their deaths. And so what he does is, instead of having a potential mutiny, because remember, they're on the other side of the world, very isolated from Spain. They're on their own. There are establishments in Cuba, but it's in many ways they're still a long way from there. It's because they're in Mexico and they're on their own. So what did he do? To prevent any of these soldiers from leaving, he deliberately stranded all his boats and destroyed them so they couldn't sail back.
Oh my God.
I heard that. That's crazy.
Destroyed all of his own ships to prevent his own soldiers from mutiny, from doing a mutiny and then trying to leave and go back to Cuba. Isn't that crazy?
That's like some Hitler insanity.
It's insanity, isn't it? It's insanity. He deliberately crashes all of his boats, and he falsely tells the men it's because they had all had some problem where the wood was rotted and they had some insect that was destroying them. He created this lie essentially because he wasn't going to tell them why he really crashed all their boats. Yeah.
Matt, would you say this would be a false flag?
Exactly. That's right. He created a false flag for his own people to force them into his delusional conquering mentality that he was trying to take on.
Wow.
Okay, so this is what's really interesting. When Cortés landed in 1519, it was precisely the same date that the Aztec had been told that their god was going to return.
What?
Which means that the Spanish had already known that. They already knew that, and they set this up deliberately so that they could have Cortés play the role as some god so that they would be all confused. And that's exactly what happened.
Imagine
Cortés and his army...
Dude, imagine how confusing it is. You're an Indian in an island, like basically like in Mexico, indigenous island, and these boats come in.
But you're expecting something.
Yeah, but you assume they're gods because they have horses, they have boats, they have guns. You're like, yo, these are aliens or gods or some bullshit like that. So I could see how you're like, oh, come in,
dude.
come in, have all my gold, have all this stuff. And they literally let them in like nothing.
On the date that you're expecting him to return.
Like,
dude. What a coincidence.
On the date, dude.
It's amazing, right? So he lands, and so because of this, the Aztec are all happy, and they embrace him. They open their arms up to him. And the head of the Aztecs' name was Moctezuma. He meets Cortés, and what Cortés does is he captures Moctezuma. Okay, he holds him hostage,
and he
forces him to allow his party to essentially invade inland. To get inland, because what they had to do was they had to conquer the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan, which was built in the shallow lake of Texcoco in Mexico.
And it wasn't only the 300 Europeans. They gathered all the other smaller tribes. So he gathered all of them up and said, let's go get the Aztecs.
Yeah, these cultures had already been corrupted through blood sacrifice and war. Long before, hundreds of years before, they had already been corrupted. So what was happening is the Aztec Empire and even the Mayas were actually sacrificing people on a daily basis, sometimes by the hundreds, if not thousands.
What?
They were ripping their hearts out. They were ripping their hearts out and doing blood sacrifice, okay? Because they had already been corrupted. They were all confused. They were desperately waiting for their god to come back. So when Cortés landed the same day, they thought he was this returning Kukulkan Quetzalcoatl, and obviously he wasn't. So what happened is you have this Aztec empire that's already riddled with corruption, and there's other indigenous cultures around the Aztec that do not like what they're doing. Okay, and so Cortés was extremely smart. He knew this. So he banded with these other indigenous cultures and had them fight his war for him. That's what he did, by convincing them that he was the good guy, whereas they were actually selling themselves out to evil to destroy another corrupted culture that had already gone down a dark road. I will fully acknowledge that. the legacy of the serpent and dragon from long ago from these wisdom bringers had already been largely lost. These cultures had just turned into warring empires at that point, and the Maya were already actually mostly gone due to primarily climate changes at the time. Okay, so Cortés marches inland with this army, right, with these other indigenous cultures, and he reaches this capital city of Tenochtitlan with very little resistance. Now, imagine this, the largest city in the entire empire, 200,000 people at least living there, is on an island. And the island has these land bridges that's on this lake. And there's only a couple of these different land bridges that connect to land. So what did Cortés do? Well, he was smart. He's not going to just invade Tenochtitlan like an idiot. He simply just blocked off the land bridges, prevented any food and water to get in, slaughtered all the soldiers that were guarding it, and he led all the people, the women and children, and the other people that were in Tenochtitlan to starve to death and run out of water. So you got to imagine
old school siege methodology right there.
Yeah, imagine thousands and thousands of people starving to death and running out of water in the heat down in Mexico. That's hitting 100 degrees. It's really, really sad. You have an army of 200 men that slaughter thousands, and he only suffered, I think, like one casualty or even none. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about this complete takeover and slaughter of the Aztec people. Instead of just killing them all off, they put in puppet dictators in to rule that were even worse than the previous rulers, to rule over them in their name. So it's like we see in a lot of these places around the world where we put in our own dictators.
What we're doing now.
Look at this terrible country that we need to go fight with war. And it's all just this game. It's all this disillusion to perceive that there's this bad guy and a good guy when really it's just the one side controlling both. Okay.
Same playbook, man. Same playbook.
Yeah. They were very smart. So when they did that. So now so what did they do? They conquered Tenochtitlan. They destroyed the entire city. They filled it in, and then they built Mexico City right on top of it. So present day Mexico City today is built on the ashes and ruins of the Aztec Empire. And so now if you go to Mexico City, you'll see there's the symbol of the eagle grabbing the serpent and conquering it. And what do you have? The Catholic Church rising up over all the ashes of what they destroyed long before, converting all the people to Catholicism and then taking away all their original belief systems and forcing them to have their own. Okay. And that's what happened to the Aztec. And then these other Spanish conquistadors, corruption took over North America up through the United States. And you just saw this, it's like a domino effect. They just kept conquering one civilization in the Americas after another until all we're left with is this grand empire of South America. Okay. So when Cortés is in Mexico and he conquered the Aztec, he was thinking to himself, wow, I did not find all this gold and riches that I had thought I was going to find. Why? Well, Mexico did have some gold and silver, but nowhere near the gold that was in South America. South America was the source of all of this gold that was making its way up into Central America because there was an ancient trade route that used to go from Mexico all the way down to South America, way before these conquistadors had gone there. So they were trading Inca gold all the way up into Mexico. Okay. So Cortés finds that. He finds people that know about this ancient trading route, and he goes back and he tells Spain, okay, hey, this is where it's all coming from. It's coming from the Inca. So what does Spain do? Well, just a few years later, in 1531, they sent another soldier, another one just as good as Cortés in terms of being trained with all these tactics in war, whose name was Francisco Pizarro. Okay, and that's not everybody knows that one. It's not quite as famous as Cortés and Columbus, but it was just as bad. Pizarro in 1531, he lands on the shores of Ecuador and he moves inland into what is modern today Peru. And he was joined by a group of only 200 men. And remember, just like the Aztec, we're talking about a massive empire, okay? But like I mentioned in the previous show, what we think of as the Inca today, these Inca leaders were just the remnants of the ancestors of what existed in those empires long before. So these rulers of the Inca, they're all that's left of the original Inca before more of these other indigenous people moved in and became part of what we just lumped together this one term.
Yeah.
When it's really a multitude, just like all the Americas, it's a multitude of a stepping stone of other cultures that came after that tried to imitate them, but they really didn't have anywhere near the sophistication. So the Inca Empire is already in trouble because most of their ancient ancestors have died off, and they only have one or two left of these ancient rulers, and one of them was named Atahualpa, okay, and that was the ruler of the Inca. So Pizarro and this group of 200 men, including cavalry and horses, they moved inland into Peru, where they were met by this Inca leader named Atahualpa. So Atahualpa meets with Pizarro, okay, in western Peru, okay. He meets with him and they're talking, and Pizarro tries to convert him to Christianity. Oh. And what he says to him, and this is, I quote, Atahualpa says to him, the head of the Inca, he says, "I will be no man's tributary," and he refuses Pizarro's request. So he's not playing along like Moctezuma was. He's not playing along that. He's not playing that game. He rejects him and says, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to corrupt my morals and do that." And so what happens? Well, in 1532, November 16th, this famous battle occurred where Pizarro and his men brutally attacked Atahualpa with all of his consorts. Okay, now this is what they did. They knew that the people had never seen these big horses, these war horses they had. So he had an idea. He put bells on the front of the horses so that when they rode, they would ring this loud bell, and it completely freaked out the Inca. They didn't understand. There was gunfire. There was all this stuff going on, and they slaughtered the Inca, even worse than the Aztec. God. In this case, the Aztec in many ways were fighting Cortés, but the Inca, most of them, thousands of them he slaughtered, were actually unarmed consorts of Atahualpa. So he said, if you're not going to play our game, we're going to essentially just wipe you out. And that's exactly what they did. They wiped out all of his consorts that were going with this Inca leader, because they were carrying him on like this large chair where they were carrying him around because he was their great leader. They essentially killed all the people protecting him, and they took him hostage. They took the Inca leader hostage, and they told the Inca people, if you do not fill an entire building full of gold, we'll execute your great leader. Okay? And so what happened? The Inca, they're frantic because it's their great leader and everything's falling apart because they have no one leading them. So they were frantic. So what do? They filled an entire building up with gold. We're talking about what would today be millions of dollars worth of gold. They filled up this whole room, right? And then what did Pizarro do? Right after he got that request, he killed the leader, Atahualpa. Oh. He killed him right in front of the Inca.
You knew that was coming. You knew that was coming.
Pizarro then tramples through the Inca because they have no one leading them. And they just go through and they destroy. And within only a couple of years, they conquered the entire Inca Empire. It completely collapsed from the north to the south, from the Hopi and Pueblo and all the civilizations of the Americas, down through the Aztec, the Maya, down into the Inca. They systematically conquered all of these ancient serpent civilizations, these ancient cultures that go back all the way to the beginning of when these high priests from Egypt had gone over and tried to create these civilizations based on knowledge and higher wisdom, and they conquered and destroyed them. And they brought
doesn't it basically go back to like your previous episode, Enlil versus Enki, in that kind of the root of, the serpent versus snake battle?
Yeah,
there's cosmic war.
That's right. Jeffrey's talking about this ancient hierarchy system that goes all the way back to, well, who were these gods? Who were these influences from long ago? And do those influences have a place here? And they do. It goes all the way back to, these wisdom bringers. that tried to help mankind reach higher states of consciousness, where this other side, represented through the eagle and Enlil and others, wanted mankind to be dumbed down and kept in our lowest state. And it's been going back and forth over and over again because there's been so much conflict in the heavens, as above, so below, right? All the conflict that's occurring in dimensions above and below us is being manifested into this third dimension with this chaos that's occurring everywhere. Okay, and so that's why the flag of Mexico is the symbol of the eagle conquering these things. It is the ultimate symbol.
God dang it, dude. It's crazy. Real quick, because we got to wrap it up. Where can we find this ancient knowledge? Is it out there? Do we know what it is, or is it gone?
It's there. You just have to know where to look, and you can't be misled by a lot of the deceptions that have come.
Where is it?
Use evidence to actually base everything you're doing. A lot of this information is very, very well laid out in the new book that I'm trying to finish right now called The Stage of Time. It's going to be out this summer. And it basically goes over all of these ancient civilizations, what destroyed them, who these gods were, controlling mankind, what the Gnostics thought, what was in ancient Egypt, and then the conquistadors of the Americas. It lays out all the evidence to prove and show you what the real history that's occurred here, and not just this polarized version that we're given in this biased doctrine we're taught in school.
That ancient stuff that you always talk about, the Library of Ashurbanipal, the Enuma Elish, the Adrahasis. I mean, there's the Sumerian kings list that you guys have talked about. I mean, this goes back so far, and like you've even said, it's so much of that is still untranslated in the Vatican, and just the little bit we have gives us so much knowledge, man.
That's right. Info. Like Jeffery was saying, it's if we really truly cared about ancient history and ancient knowledge and understanding all of this, we wouldn't have the majority of all the cuneiform tablets, which was the earliest known writings from these civilizations. We wouldn't have the most of them still untranslated today. Like, they don't even care. They don't even care.
Well, they care enough to hide it. That's why they care. They do care. They care that they want us not to hear it because it destroys their entire power-based situation.
Saying before, Matt, about how DC was laid out, man. There is energy in the mathematics of how these things were built, the geometry of the structures, the architecture. There is energy in that.
How do you create a certain kind of energy? If you create war all over the planet, you have this fear mentality of people being kept in this certain state. Well, there you see this correlation that just keeps happening over and over again. It's about how to keep people in a certain state of consciousness and energy, keep them in their lowest state, so they can be obedient workers that are not going to question anything. And then if they do question it, someone like me comes along. Most of them, if they're in a certain state of consciousness that haven't done any research, they're just going to reject this. It's too difficult. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know what he's talking about, right? It's crazy. They're just going to reject it and move along. Whereas if you actually sit down and look at the evidence and you start reading into all these ancient history, you have your mind blown.
Hey guys, this has been great. Please tell me where we can find you guys on the internet.
Thank you, man. I appreciate you guys, Sam. Always much love. Nice to meet you, G, and Matthew, as always, brother. Another slice of just amazing business there. Our new website is going to be dropping any day now, www.theconspiracyfarm.com. But I love you guys, man. Just keep killing it, man. We just, each one teach one, dude. United we stand out this son bitch.
There you go.
Boom. Matt, where can they find you?
Check out my YouTube channel at Matthew LaCroix, LaCroix. And then I also have a website with a lot of ancient text translations, information, pictures, and details on the latest book at thestageoftime.com.
All right, man. Guys, this was glorious. Jeffrey, always a pleasure. Matthew, always a pleasure. And we'll see you guys on the other side. Until then, be kind to each other. Do 3 nice things to everybody. Learn the rules of the Ronin, and we'll do this again. I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.